All right, we're good to go.
We are.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's NPA webinar. My name is Gary Dunnett. I'm the CEO of the National Parks Association, and just begin by acknowledging that we're all meeting on various Aboriginal lands and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Tonight we have a webinar that's being presented by Pamela Fallow from BirdLife Australia. Pamela's going to talk about Glossy Black-Cockatoos, which I'm sure that many of our members are very familiar with as one of those cranky sounding sort of noises that you hear while you're walking, particularly if you're sort of spending time in places like around Sydney, like Ku-ring-gai Chase and Barara Valley, where they're relatively abundant. I've got to say, it was one of the big signs of the impacts, the extent of impacts of the 2019-20 fires when we started to get the occasional glossy black in Royal, which was a place that, you know, they hadn't been, well, they were very rarely recorded. But looking forward to hear what Pamela's got to say about the status of the species across New South Wales and I suspect nationally as well. Thanks, Pamela.
Well, thank you, Gary, for the introduction, and good evening, everyone. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell you about some of our recent bushfire recovery work at BirdLife Australia. Tonight, I'll start off by providing an overview of the priority birds for bushfire recovery and how they were identified. I just need to share my screen so you can look at some lovely photos. Is that coming through all right, NPA?
Yes, that's all good.
Great, thank you. All right, so after I talk about the bushfire priority birds, I'll talk a bit more about a couple of the bushfire recovery projects we've just completed at BirdLife, both of which concern birds found in New South Wales. So what are the priority birds and how did this list come about? So while the bushfires of 2019 and 2020 were still burning, BirdLife started some spatial analyses of fire overlap with bird distribution as a means of predicting which birds would be most affected by the fires. Now, these analyses were provided to an expert committee called the Wildlife and Threatened Species Bushfire Recovery Expert Panel, a panel that comprised a range of experts from research institutions led by the Threatened Species Commissioner. These spatial analyses were considered along with the conservation status of fire-affected bird species and subspecies, how threatened they were before the fires, were they listed in the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, as well as other relevant information about the status of each bird before the fires. Were they already in trouble with it? Were they already facing some severe threats, and would they be pushed further towards extinction by the fires? As well as information about the fires themselves, such as fire severity, which is how much damage the fires did to the environment, and the time since the last burn, as well as relevant information about each bird's physical, behavioural and ecological traits that might influence their response to fire and how well then they can escape fire. So through this process and by considering all these different pieces of information, they put together a list of priority birds. And this is the list, which was published by the Australian government, and it indicates the top 17 birds which this committee decided were going to be priorities for bushfire recovery over the next year or so. Now, bushfire recovery is not a quick thing. It's not something that you can easily put an end date on. It's something that's going to take a long time, and it's probably not going to be the last major bushfire that we're going to be dealing with. So anyway, this is a way for us to prioritize our efforts. And of course, over time, we need to continually monitor the effectiveness of what we're doing and make sure that it is working and review this list. So the EPBC Act listed status here, that is what each species or subspecies is listed at nationally. And you'll see that not all birds on this list are EPBC listed. Those that are EPBC listed are estimated to have had at least 10% of their distribution impacted by fire. Their distribution being the geographical area where the species occurs. The birds that are not EPBC listed were estimated to have at least 30% of their distribution impacted by fire. And some birds here we were previously considered to be secure, for example, the gang cockatoo. And now there's a lot of work being done to understand what the impacts of the fire were on gang cockatoos, and it's now being considered for listing. So I'll now show you the priority birds that BirdLife is currently working on and has a focus on at the moment. So BirdLife comprises a variety of programs which focus on different types of birds. And the Preventing Extinctions program is the program I'm based in. It's a relatively new program. It's only been around for I think about 3 years. So there were a few birds that were already a focus for BirdLife, and we had conservation projects for example, the critically endangered Regent honeyeater and the western ground parrot. But Preventing Extinctions has picked up projects for a lot of the other priority birds for bushfire recovery. I'll now go into so what we've been doing in the Preventing Extinctions program since this bushfire recovery work started, which was just after the fires, and well, the fires were still ongoing in the start of 2020. The immediate response was getting down to Kangaroo Island. Most of the island was burnt, and it has a lot of endemic species that are found nowhere else. So there's a project in Kangaroo Island which is ongoing, and it's looking to monitor birds down there, such as the Kangaroo Island southern emu wren, which is pictured here, and the Kangaroo Island western whipbird and Kangaroo Island glossy black-cockatoo. So down there they went and conducted rapid assessments to try and understand, how many birds were left and what's going on. And then of course, follow-up surveys to see how they might be recovering. There's an ongoing citizen science project down there, which will be monitoring the birds. And then glossy black-cockatoos in East Gippsland, Victoria. So that was one of the first bushfire recovery projects that we started, and that is also ongoing, where glossy black-cockatoos are critically endangered. Next, we commenced a project for superb lyrebird, specifically the southern subspecies of superb lyrebird. And this was a partnership with La Trobe University, funded by WWF Australia. And that project mapped fire impacts on habitat for the southern superb lyrebird, identified major refuges for the birds, assessed their suitability as an umbrella species for other wet forest birds, and identified immediate threats to important populations. Next, we commenced a couple more projects, one for eastern bristlebird and eastern ground parrot. That project assessed the nationwide impacts of the fires on these birds, which wasn't straightforward because they occur across 4 states and territories. So they're found but they're found in Queensland, New South Wales, the ACT and Victoria. So there was a lot of collaboration with other organisations who work on these birds to understand who has been collecting data pre and post fire, and can we measure those impacts of the fires, because we can't measure the impact if we didn't have data before fires occurred. So that project also developed a draft recovery plan for each bird and guidance on monitoring these birds so that we can keep monitoring their recovery over time. And we also collected acoustic recordings of their calls where we found them, and have provided those calls to a couple of labs that are working on acoustic call recognizers, so artificial intelligence that can be used to pick out calls in recordings of the sound in that area. The Western Ground Parrot project is also one that started back in 2020 and it is ongoing. Western Ground Parrot is a critically endangered species, and that's an ongoing piece of work. Then we commenced a project for Rufous Scrubbird. This is a partnership with the Australian National University. So they have been evaluating whether Rufous Scrubbird individuals can be identified from their vocalizations. They're working on a species distribution model to guide surveys and evaluate impacts of climate change on the species. And they're piloting a study to monitor Rufous Scrubbird, and that project is ongoing as well. Then BirdLife applied for and were successful in becoming the species coordinator for 2 bushfire recovery priority birds. One was the eastern bristlebird, and the other being the southeastern glossy black-cockatoo. That's a subspecies, not a species. And in that role as species coordinator, we are chairing and running working groups of organisations who work on these birds so that we can identify priorities for their bushfire recovery and work together to make sure we're making the most value out of the limited resources that we have to recover these birds. And then off the back of our existing work for eastern bristlebird, we were successful in achieving funding to start a new project, which I will go into more detail on, which we referred to as the Eastern Bristlebird Connectivity Project. And for southeastern glossy black-cockatoo, the Great Glossy Count. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about these 2 projects, which we've just wrapped up and have some nice results. So southern eastern bristlebird. This is, I guess, a less well-known species, but definitely a species that you should get to know. The eastern bristlebird is 2 subspecies. So there's the northern eastern bristlebird, which is found in Queensland and northern New South Wales. And there's the southern eastern bristlebird, which is found in New South Wales and Victoria. So the southern eastern bristlebird is endangered in New South Wales and critically endangered in Victoria. There's not a lot of them left due primarily to habitat clearance. They're a ground-dwelling species. They're not great flyers. They don't need to be. They've got great legs. So they're primarily found in dense vegetation near the ground. Now, the southern population of the southern eastern bristlebird is estimated to comprise around only 400 birds, and that's a very small number, especially when you consider the range in which they're found. 400 birds is not a lot of individuals to cover such a broad area, which I will show you on the next slide. And those 400 birds were also known to be split between Nadji Nature Reserve in New South Wales and Regenerators National Park in Victoria. So I'll just bring up a map so you can see what this looks like. So that dashed line is the New South Wales Victoria border, and Nadji Nature Reserve is towards the top of the map, and then below that is Victoria and where Regenerators National Park starts. We have a subpopulation in Nadji around that area circled there near the coastal heaths, and then in Regenerators National Park over the border is the other subpopulation of eastern bristlebird. So what we wanted to do in order to inform bushfire recovery for this work is to understand whether these two subpopulations of southern eastern bristlebird, whether they were connected. There's a gap in between the two there, and that gap is largely because that terrain is quite difficult to access, so it hadn't been surveyed in a long time. And we didn't know whether there were birds there, whether there was suitable habitat for eastern bristlebird there. So our aim in this project was to answer that question. And then once we had those results, that would go on to inform management for these subpopulations potentially. There's a question mark right there. Now, field work for this project was, I would say, difficult. It's not an area that is a light walk. I would say it requires like some, proper physical fitness, and there's quicksand. It's not a very hospitable area. It's very remote. The ecologists that conducted the field work had to be dropped out there for a couple of weeks at a time. They had to find their own drinking water. They had to deal with quicksand and parasites and all sorts of goodies. And when they were out there, they were spending a lot of time conducting direct listening surveys, which is going out to predetermined points and listening for eastern bristlebird, because they're usually easier to detect from their calls than trying to spot them visually. They also conducted vegetation assessments, so noting down major vegetation groups that were out there, as well as the structure of the vegetation, and assessing whether that area contained habitat for eastern bristlebird and potential habitat corridors, which might allow subpopulations to move between Nadji Nature Reserve in New South Wales and Regenerators National Park in Victoria. They also deployed acoustic recorders. So there were 2 field trips, and the first field trip was the deployment. The second field trip was the retrieval. And these acoustic recorders were put out at a standard height and set to record the environment for about a month. And after they were retrieved, the recordings were downloaded and then analyzed, which is a very labor-intensive process, analyzing the recordings. If you're going to do it manually, you have to sit there and listen through them, or do it visually. And there's a lot of sound there that could be other birds other than eastern bristlebird. So luckily we had some help from the Arthur Rylah Institute in Victoria, who at the same time we were doing this work, were developing a recognizer for eastern bristlebird, which is artificial intelligence software that analyzes the recording and points out when it thinks it's found an eastern bristlebird call. It was in development, it wasn't perfect, but it helped pick out sounds that we could then validate as eastern bristlebird or not. And that helped cut down some of that analysis time. So we had people out there listening to detect bristlebirds, and we had the recordings that we analyzed later to see if there were birds detected in areas where we hadn't been listening at the right time. And we found bristlebirds, which is great. When you've only got a few hundred individuals left, finding more birds and more habitat is really important. But also it means that we need to consider that the two subpopulations are connected, and what this means for managing those subpopulations which have been managed separately. Now, knowing that they are connected means that the birds can move between subpopulations potentially, which allows them to interbreed. What you don't want when you're getting down to small numbers is for birds to be breeding with other birds that are too closely related. You have problems with inbreeding depression and a lack of genetic diversity, which means they won't be as resistant to, say, a disease that comes through. So knowing that birds are able to move around and interbreed is very good news. This also suggests that for areas in Naji Nature Reserve, for example, that were very burnt, birds could be moving around and repopulating, recolonizing areas after they recover from fire. So that is great news, and also very important for the ongoing management of eastern bristlebird, or at least the southern population. I'm now going to switch to the southeastern glossy black-cockatoo, which is the other project that we recently wrapped up. Well, one of the projects for southeastern glossy black-cockatoo. It is a subspecies of glossy black-cockatoo, of which there are 3. So there's the northern glossy black-cockatoo, which is found in northern Queensland, the southeastern glossy black-cockatoo, most widely distributed subspecies, which is found from southeastern Queensland through New South Wales and down into East Gippsland in Victoria. And there's also the Kangaroo Island glossy black-cockatoo, which is just on Kangaroo Island. Now, southeastern glossy black-cockatoo is vulnerable in New South Wales, the ACT and Queensland, and it's critically endangered in Victoria. This is largely due to loss of habitat. And when I say habitat, I'm talking about feeding habitat, so the trees that they feed on, as well as breeding habitats or trees with hollows. So they nest in tree hollows, and tree hollows tend to form in very old trees. Usually, I mean, depending on the species, we're talking 80 or over 100 years old. So it's very important to preserve trees with hollows. And now glossy black-cockatoos, they specialize on she oak cones. So she oaks are also known as casuarinas or alocasuarinas, and they produce cones with seeds in them. And the glossy black-cockatoo's bill is adapted to processing these cones and taking the seeds out. And if you see chewings, which are the remains of these cones that glossy black-cockatoos leave behind, they look kind of like a little pineapple ring. They process them in a particular way to extract those seeds. Now, but this specialized diet also means that they're vulnerable because they rely on she oaks, and as was mentioned, after the 2019-2020 bushfires, glossies started showing up in areas where they hadn't been seen for a long time. We received reports of them showing up in areas where they hadn't been seen for up to 50 years. And we take it that this is an indication that the fires had removed a lot of their feed trees, and they were having to travel a lot further in order to find food, and therefore they were showing up in areas where they hadn't been seen for a long time. And that's about 40% of their distribution impacted by the bushfires. So that's a lot of feed trees and nesting trees, which were taken away from glossy black-cockatoos. So what can we do? What should we do right now for glossy black-cockatoos? The number one thing is to protect the remaining feed trees and breeding habitat. So that means the she oaks that they feed on and the trees that provide hollows that they can use for nesting. We also need to secure their long-term habitat. So there are some feed trees that are productive now and which are producing cones, but in the future, in the longer term, we need to replace a lot of the habitat that was lost. So in a few years' time, there'll be, an ongoing supply of food. She oaks take about 10 years to produce cones. So if you plant a she oak now, it's not going to feed a glossy black-cockatoo for a long time. So we really need to think about the immediate needs for these birds as well as longer term planning. And also we need to monitor their recovery after the fires. There's still a lot that we don't know about glossy black-cockatoos, such as the impacts of the fires and of climate change. We don't know how they move through their range. We don't know how successful their nests are. And the way we can begin to understand these and help them recover is to collect data. And that is why citizen science is so important for the recovery of glossy black-cockatoo, and why we piloted the Great Glossy Count. So this was an event that was held in March this year. It was a citizen science project, a partnership with the Glossy Black Conservancy. Now, the Glossy Black Conservancy is a Queensland-based group which held a glossy count, but just in the Queensland and northern New South Wales area. Now, I've put a point there that this was funded by BirdLife Australia supporters and the Australian government through a grant to BirdLife. And I think it's important to note that the government doesn't knock on the door and say, hey, would you like some money? We have to apply for funding from the government, and that is a process which is time consuming and doesn't guarantee any funding. And so the funding provided by BirdLife supporters pays for the people who apply for the money from the government. So when we have a project that's funded by a grant, it's the grant, but it's also the people who allow BirdLife to do its work. Now, the aims of this project were to increase awareness of glossy black-cockatoos. Not everybody knows about the glossy black-cockatoo or what the threats are to glossy black-cockatoos. And to train citizen scientists who could collect data on glossy black-cockatoos and their feed trees. Glossies are often mistaken for other black cockatoos that occur in the same area, and you wouldn't blame people for making that mistake. They look quite similar to like a red-tailed black cockatoo. So a little bit of training is required to identify between different species of black cockatoo, and then also to distinguish between males and females and adults and juveniles. That's important data that will really help us with recovery work. And as mentioned, this citizen science data is absolutely crucial to informing bushfire recovery work. There aren't enough resources to have paid staff monitoring a bird that is so widespread at such low densities. And so citizen science is the way forward for the recovery of glossies. And I'll just go over the activities that were involved in this project, because there's the event, but there was a lot of preparation and before the event. So first there was the promotional activities, so just letting people know that the event was happening, and recruiting people to become citizen scientists and participate in the event. We had to develop new training materials to educate people on how to identify glossy black cockatoos and their feed trees, and how to collect and record that data. Then we had face-to-face workshops. Glossy Black Conservancy ran some workshops, and BirdLife ran workshops to reinforce all of that training information. And then also an online workshop with a live Q&A because of COVID, and because not everybody could make it to a face-to-face workshop. Then we had the coordinated Great Glossy Count on the 26th of March. And there's a lot of benefit to that point in time snapshot of what is happening. And also it was a good opportunity to get everybody out at the same time and having a go at collecting data. And then after all the data has been collected, there's a bit of work to do behind the scenes for data that came in late, like collected on the day, but submitted late. So that has to be processed, and then we need to clean the data, so make sure that it's ready for analysis. And then we evaluated the volunteer experience, because we do want to make it an efficient and an enjoyable experience for our citizen scientists, and improve on our own processes. So the event was promoted first through the BirdLife network. If you sign up for BirdLife's newsletters, you get news about upcoming events and ways that you can participate in collecting data and citizen science. And the Conservancy had its own network, and it did the same there. We had very limited promotion via social media because we found that we were overwhelmed with the number of people who registered, and because this was a pilot and we had a limited time to pull it all off, we had to apply a cap to this the number of people who could register. So we did end up doing all the promotion and the media release because we reached that limit sooner than we expected. So we had an online registration form where people provided information, like contact information, so that we could keep them updated about training opportunities and provide them with all the information they need to participate in the count. When it came to training materials, we identified a need for some sort of something you could have in your hand or take with you in the field that you could refer to when you are looking for glossies or when you found glossies. So we developed the Southeastern Glossy Black-Cockatoo Field Guide. This was written by experts at BirdLife and the Glossy Black Conservancy. And it's a nice little handbook that goes through the basics of identifying glossy black-cockatoos and their feed trees. This is available on the BirdLife website. If you Google Great Glossy Count BirdLife, that's probably the easiest way to get to the web page. And at the bottom, there is a link to this field guide. When we had training workshops, we also handed out hard copies. I've got a couple of excerpts from the field guide. So as you can see, there's some guidance on how to identify glossy black-cockatoos and distinguish them from other black-cockatoo species you might see. There's information and some lovely photos on how to distinguish between males and females and adults and juveniles. And then there are more than a few pages about she oaks and how to tell the difference between different species of she oak, because it is really important that we understand where their feed trees are. And it's not too bad in Victoria where I'm based, and when I went out to look for she oaks, I only had to deal with 2 species, but in New South Wales you've got 10. So this guide is probably of particular importance for you if you'd like to get to know your she oak species and tell the difference between what you find out there. So in addition to the field guide, we also developed a series of videos with the Glossy Black Conservancy. So 4 videos, which are all available on YouTube if you want to watch them. How to distinguish between different species of black cockatoo, how to identify males and females, how to identify their feed trees, the she oaks, and then how to age chewings, which are the remains of the she oak cones that glossies leave behind, and evidence that they have been using those trees as a feed tree. Now at BirdLife, we have a software called BirdData. It's a website, it's also a phone app. And for the Great Glossy Count, we created a module just for Southeastern Glossy Black-Cockatoo. So citizen scientists could go out there and collect their data and record it via the BirdData app or website when they got home. And so part of the training materials we developed was a guide for using BirdData and recording surveys, bird surveys and tree information in BirdData. And for people who hate technology or have a phone with a crappy battery, we also provided a data sheet that you could print out and fill in and send us your data sheet later. So the data that came through the data sheets was processed after the day of the count, and we manually entered that into BirdData. And then in addition to all of those training materials, we provided volunteers with plenty of material on like how to participate in the day, a Q&A, questions and answers that might come up, and also a code of conduct for volunteers, which is, if you're a decent person, it's common sense, as well as risks. So understanding your safety in the field and how to conduct a risk assessment. So there's plenty of material that will help you become a citizen scientist. You don't need to do a 3 or 4 year degree. Just have a look at the website and skip all of that, and don't worry about accumulating that help debt. The face-to-face workshops we ran to cover topics such as safety in the field, bird and feed tree identification, and how to record data. And these workshops were held in southeastern Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. The asterisk there is because in the end we had to cancel one workshop in Queensland due to the floods, and one of the New South Wales workshops was cancelled due to a COVID outbreak. We do our best, and even if you couldn't make a face-to-face workshop, we had the online workshop, which was shortly after the face-to-face workshops. Covered all the same topics. Also had a live question and answer session at the end, where we had a panel of experts and BirdLife staff there to answer questions that our citizen scientists had. That was well attended. We had over 300 people sign up, and most of those people watched it on the night, but we also had a few hundred views of it in the couple of weeks afterwards as well. The online workshop is still online if you're really keen to check that out and find out more about how that all went. And it includes the training videos, so you can also learn about glossy black-cockatoos as well. On the day of the Great Glossy Count, we had people out there across Queensland, New South Wales, the ACT and Victoria. Every volunteer was allocated a site manually based on the information they provided in their registration form. This was a very labour-intensive process for us at BirdLife and the Conservancy. So in future, we're hoping to create a new process that will allow you to pick your own site with some guidance. But where the citizen scientists go is up to them. We allocated sites that were within the range of southeastern glossy black-cockatoo, and which were sites where there were previous observations of the birds or which had habitat usually. And so you can see in the pictures here, people are out, they're looking for she oaks, they're looking for chewings under the she oaks, and of course looking for birds. Now on the day of the count, we had most of the data submitted via the Bird Data app, which you can use offline. So if you lose your internet connection in a remote area, that shouldn't be an issue. We ended up breaking the record for the number of surveys in Bird Data on a single day. We don't track exactly how many people go out and conduct the survey, but we had over 300 people respond yes to our SMS that asked, are you out? Are you participating in the count? So I've got a breakdown there in the table that shows how many participants were in New South Wales, and that's almost half of the whole cohort of citizen scientists that we had out on the day of the Great Glossy Count. And these are the results. It's not bad for one day's work collecting data. And this is what you can do with a citizen science workforce and people who care about bushfire recovery of glossy black-cockatoos. So these points on the map are surveys submitted. They are not necessarily birds observed, but it's important to note that we are interested in zero data, which means if you go out to an area and you don't see any birds, we want to know that, because that is telling us, okay, that's where the birds are not at the moment. If you don't find anything, it might seem boring, but it is still important data. So the infographic that is on the right-hand side of this slide is showing the results of the count we counted 130 birds on the day, which is not bad. I mean, considering the area that we covered, and it wasn't the best time of year, March, but you can still see birds at any time of year. So the benefits of being a citizen scientist, to me, it's obvious. It's about being able to do something to contribute to the recovery of threatened birds. When the fires were happening, I think we all felt a little bit helpless and a little bit depressed, but there's certainly a lot that we can do. There's a lot that anyone can do. If you want to contribute to the bushfire recovery of threatened birds, you certainly can. You can also enjoy learning about the birds themselves and talking to experts who work on these birds. There's a lot to learn. It's very interesting. And so it's a great opportunity to learn more and get interested. And then when you participate in a count, or if it's not the counter, you just go out to collect data, you can enjoy the outdoors with your friends, or you can escape your friends and family and go outdoors. Either way, you can have a great time, get some exercise. Going for a walk is nice. It's even nicer when you know what you're looking at and you're finding some interesting things. You may participate in a great glossy count and you may not find any glossies, but you'll probably see other cool birds and other interesting things. So it's just an opportunity to have a nice day outdoors. And then while you're out there, collect some data. So our further work for southeastern glossy black-cockatoo. Now we have a couple of current projects which are ongoing. BirdLife Australia is still the national species coordinator for southeastern glossy black-cockatoo. And that means that we are coordinating a working group for the subspecies and involved in ongoing work for them. That should run till the end of September, after which we're going to continue working with all the organisations who are also working on the recovery of glossy black-cockatoo. There's some work to be done in coordinating everyone, because there are a lot of groups doing some great work over the 4 states and territories, and a little bit of coordination goes a long way to making sure that we don't duplicate effort. We have the Bushfire Recovery Project in East Gippsland, Victoria, which started very soon after the 2019-2020 fires. That is doing some more on-ground management work for glossy black-cockatoos. So it's data collection, but it's also using that data to protect stands of sheo which are productive, and trialing artificial hollows to see if they're going to work for glossy black-cockatoos. And we're keen to extend that work into New South Wales, where we're not doing that sort of work at the moment. So it's a matter of watching this space. And building on the great glossy count that we held at the start of this year, we've got training materials ready for new citizen scientists. We're working on improved systems for people to participate in the training and to book their own survey site. So you won't have to rely on us to allocate a site to you. Hopefully you'll be able to select your own site, which also means that we can remove the cap on the number of people who can participate, because we won't have to assign sites manually. It'd be nice to run a count at a different time of year. March was all right, but it's not the best time to look for birds. So sometime towards the end of the year, around late September or October, is a better time to go out there and look for glossy black-cockatoos. But you can look for them at any time, so don't have to wait for a count. Just get out there and get exploring. And of course, now we have a baseline data set, which we can use to compare new data sets with. So conducting one count is great, produces a lot of data, but if you want to monitor recovery over time, you need to keep collecting data so that you can see how things change. And so the ongoing monitoring also will help us understand whether what we are doing with glossy black-cockatoos, whether it is effective, and whether we need to amend our approach to make sure that we are making the most of the resources that we have. So thank you everyone for listening. I'd like to acknowledge my team and the people who are involved in this project. But I'd also like to give special thanks to all the citizen scientists who have been involved in the Great Glossy Count and who collect data more generally. You don't have to wait for a count. You can collect data at any time. Bird Data is the app and website that BirdLife staff use as well. We don't do a good enough job at reporting back to volunteers about how we're using the data, but I can tell you we definitely use it. It was used to identify the priority species for bushfire recovery, and it is still being used. So thank you very much for people who are collecting that data. If you didn't collect it, it just wouldn't be collected, and we wouldn't know how to help these birds if we don't know where they are. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Pamela. That was great. Look, I was really remiss at the start of this and didn't mention to everybody that if you have questions, you should put them into the question and answer sort of tab down below. But thankfully, Sam jumped in and put a note to everyone to that effect. And so we do have a couple of questions, but MC's prerogative is always to ask the first question of the evening. And Pamela, I guess one of the things that's really confronting about glossy blacks is just how narrow their dietary requirements are. And we all know that there's, well, most if not all Allocasia species don't do well under high intensity fires. Is there any mapping happening at the moment which is actually telling us whether there are parts of the Great Divide where, you know, essentially we've lost that food resource or they've lost that food resource for another generation? You know, I'm thinking about some of the images you'll see of places like Moreton National Park, which was just a moonscape after the fire event.
So the tricky thing with she oaks is we can map the she oaks, we can map the distribution of she oaks, but glossy black-cockatoos, even though they feed almost exclusively on she oaks, it doesn't mean that every she oak is one that a glossy black-cockatoo would feed on. And it's not clear why they feed on some and not others. It doesn't seem to be related to like how many cones there are on the tree, but glossies seem to ignore some trees with cones and then go crazy on others. So that is one of the reasons why when we had people out on the day of the Great Glossy Count, we were asking them to find those chewings, because the chewings are evidence of whether a she oak is being used as a feed tree. We don't need to like right now, we don't need to know where every she oak is, because not every she oak is a feed tree, although there may be trees which are not producing cones, not productive at the moment, but they will be productive later. So we are making tweaks to that bird data module for southeastern glossy black-cockatoos, so people can record where they find she oaks and not just she oaks with evidence of glossy black-cockatoos feeding in them.
Yep. Okay, and look, that gives us a nice segue to Marcella's question, and it's in the context of the New South Wales South Coast. So I think I'm interpreting what she was saying as whether there are specific allocated arenas such as littoralis, which are more important as feed trees than things like tortuosa.
I'm not a casuarina expert,
No,
so I hesitate to answer that question. I really don't know. I'd be really interested to know as well. I think it would take me a bit of work just to get across the 10 species in New South Wales. I'm based in Victoria, so I had it easy and I only had to remember 2. But I can take that question on notice and get back to you, because you know, we know a few people that we collaborate with who might have the answer to that.
Yep. Okay, and there's a couple of questions around the differences between, you know, easy ID steps for the differences between glossies and red tails, and the obvious answer is to live in places where there's only one species. But I note that Sam has actually put in the link to the BirdLife information sheets on that, and obviously we'd encourage people to think about going off and doing the training. There's a question from Chris about the bristlebird population at Jarvis Bay, who was asking, is this not a sizable enough population to be considered in your in the not the recovery plan, but in the bushfire response plan?
That population, the New South Wales government is doing a pretty good job of monitoring the bristlebirds in New South Wales. So we have been working closely with them and also the Victorian government to make sure that the work we're doing is complementing their work. So the reason why those birds weren't part of our study is because the New South Wales government are looking after that.
Yep.
And we addressed that knowledge gap about what's happening between those subpopulations straddling the New South Wales and Victorian border.
Question from Bernadette, which is basically whether the glossies face competition from other wildlife, particularly other parrots or cockatoo species.
They do for nesting hollows in particular. There's a lot of birds and also mammals that need hollows. It's probably a good to mention as well that we noticed that after the bushfires, there were a lot of community groups who started nest box programs, and nest boxes can be effective for bushfire recovery, but we're not, for glossy black cockatoos at the moment, it's not something that seems to be evidence-based. And also, when you are thinking about putting out nest boxes or constructing nest boxes, there are also risks associated with them. So like we just mentioned, there are competitors, and sometimes you're trying to help support the recovery of a particular species which is threatened, and then if you put nest boxes up, it actually supports other species that compete with the species that you're trying to protect. So you need to be mindful that if you are going to start a nest box project, that you are targeting a particular species, and that you are monitoring those nest boxes to make sure that whatever is using them is not going to compete with the animal that you're trying to support.
Okay. And look, I'm going to ask a final question again from me. Pamela, you mentioned in passing that you were looking at whether superb lyrebirds might actually operate as an umbrella species. And I guess as an organisation that has for the last few years concentrated very much on koalas, possibly too much on koalas, I'm just wondering, do you see that umbrella species concept as a useful one in conservation management and advocacy?
I do, because often when you're helping one like flagship species or umbrella species, you end up assisting a lot of species that live in the same habitat. So that study on superb lyrebirds looked at other wet forest birds that co-occurred with the superb lyrebird, at least the southern subspecies. And it didn't delve too much further than that, other than looking at like co-occurrence. So there are other interactions that could be considered and need to be the subject of further work. But also, you know, we have species that people have never heard of, and sometimes it's difficult to get support for something, some little brown job that they've never heard of. But if you say superb lyrebird, people know what that is. And I'm aware that there are projects that are aimed at lyrebird and friends, and so you can use umbrella species as a way of supporting, say, for example, a group of species that would all benefit from habitat regeneration in a particular area.
Thank you so much. Look, I just want to finish by thanking you for your presentation tonight, and to thank BirdLife and your colleagues for the fantastic work you do. Thanks also to everyone who's participated tonight. I hope that you've enjoyed the presentation, and we look forward to our next one in, Sam, raise your hand if it's in 2 weeks. It's in 2 weeks, perfect. All right, thanks everybody and good night.